Kamala Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, has praised China. He just spoke Chinese. He's lived there for more than a year. He taught there for a year and visited about 30 times. He even reportedly chose to get married on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. His wife said, he wanted to get married on a day that he'll always remember. They honeymooned in China. Walz speaks a small amount of Mandarin, as you just heard. He ran a business taking students to China. In 2019, he called for President Trump to end his trade war with China. He claimed that it was hurting American farmers. And then in 2016, Walz said, quote, "I don't fall into the category that China necessarily needs to be an adversarial relationship." Let's talk about what a potential Vice President Walz would look like. Joining me now is Hudson Institute Senior Fellow, Atlas Organization founder, and the author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward. Jonathan, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. What's your take on Walz's view of China and what that could mean for policy?
Hi, Maria. Well, look, I think the important thing to understand is nothing about a vice presidential pick in the U.S. is going to change what we're dealing with in Beijing. It doesn't change their economic strategies, their military strategies, their sort of deceptive diplomacy with the U.S. I mean, they're looking for people that want to talk to them more, trade with them more, while they, buy up all the ports in Africa and prepare for war in the Pacific. So, to see someone who's spent time there, who lived there, who taught there, I mean, that's all fine. There are plenty of stories like that. I think he has a couple of positives on human rights, was a supporter of Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, but none of that, I think, indicates that there's, a serious depth of understanding of what to do about the most important national security challenge of the 21st century. I mean, that's a completely different level that, teaching English in China does not necessarily prepare one for. So I think it's too early for those that are saying, oh, what an asset that this guy has been there, and or those even that are saying what a liability.
That's not what I'm saying, Jonathan. That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying that if you're talking about a potential vice president saying he does not want an adversarial relationship with China, what could that portend in terms of policy in the next administration? We've already seen horrendous policy from the Biden administration toward China. China has been able to get away with whatever it wants in America. You know that. You've written several books about it. Okay, that includes a surveillance balloon that's traveled the country, decades of, with surveillance, decades of intellectual property theft, fentanyl flowing freely into America, 50,000 Chinese nationals coming through the border in the last 2 years. All of these things have been met with zero response. So my question really was, are we going to see a continuation of zero response, no deterrence whatsoever to communist China and its bad behavior on America?
I think that's possible. I mean, that's certainly possible. I mean, anyone who thinks that that the U.S. is driving an adversarial relationship is wrong. I mean, it's Beijing. So, I don't think we've seen this guy say anything that shows an indication of what's really at stake strategically or how to handle it.
Yeah, and also at stake is this last 3 years, we've watched China, communist China, cozy up to Vladimir Putin and Russia, making the threat that much worse. Former President Trump slamming the Biden-Harris administration yesterday on foreign policy, saying that they've allowed our greatest adversaries to join forces. Watch this.
They've allowed China and Russia to do the impossible combined. They're natural enemies. They always have been, because China needs more land and Russia has it. They've always been natural enemies. They've now become one force, and then now they're adding Iran to it, and they're adding North Korea to it. Pretty powerful force. This is something that is unthinkable that they allowed to happen.
So, Jonathan, you've traveled extensively throughout China, throughout Russia. You know these two adversaries well. What is your take on the position of the two countries in terms of getting together against America?
Well, yeah, I love that he said combined. I think, I've been saying for a long time that Russia, China are a combined adversary, and I think that's the right way to understand it. But this has been going on for a very long time. I mean, it's at least 10 years old. It's probably 20 years old.
Okay.
I mean, the two have intended to fight the U.S. together in the 21st century. I mean, I think we saw the first hints of that in 2014, just as Putin, seized Crimea and China began its island building in the South China Sea. So they've been coordinated for, at least a decade, really longer if you look at some of the roots of even that activity. And the U.S. is going to have to deal with that problem. I think that was always in the making. I mean, photos like that of wine glasses. I mean, I had that in China's Vision of Victory in 2019 before, before this event in Ukraine took on an even deeper phase with the new Russian invasion. So what we have to do, I think, is to treat them as a combined adversary. And the biggest problem is that we've imposed, essentially, as you said before, on other things. There have been zero costs to the People's Republic of China from the United States on their support for Putin's war. And that's one where I think it's relatively straightforward what to do. I mean, you basically have to go after the Chinese companies and banks that are enabling Putin's war, that are actively engaged in Russia. And we have a use it or lose it period, I think, with U.S. sanctions. I mean, the power of the U.S. financial system at this time is something that could cause enormous effects on China. And that's really what I think we should be doing. You have to impose costs for their support for Putin. And then I think Mike Pompeo had a really, I thought, appealing peace plan in the Wall Street Journal recently on Ukraine, where he talks about unleashing U.S. energy potential, putting real sanctions on the Russian energy sector, U.S. military buildup, NATO spending going to 3% across the board, $500 billion lend-lease program for Ukraine so that they have access, which they would ultimately repay, to essentially enough military kit to really win the war. And then no restrictions on the weapons that Ukraine could obtain and use. So that's what Mike Pompeo believes would win the war. And I would agree with that. I mean, you've got to defeat Putin in Europe and crush, certain elements of the Chinese economy that are supporting this. And that's how you really go after the problem. And that'll create all the problems in that relationship that have existed. They go through cycles in Russia-China relations. They've been allies, they've been enemies, they've fought border conflicts, they've come back together, but they've always been hostile to the United States. And that's something that predates everything we're talking about.
How likely do you think China and Russia could go to war against the U.S.? This National Defense Report that we've been talking about recently is incredibly disturbing, Jonathan, where the National Defense Commission says that the U.S. would lose a war, given the strength of the militaries and the investment that the Chinese and the Russians have been putting in their own militaries. You saw that report I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how likely? Well, I think that's what I've been trying to tell people since China's Vision of Victory. I mean, this is what they're planning to do. They're planning to go to war with the United States. I mean, China is preparing for a war with the United States. They have Putin on their side in order to make that much more of a problem for us. And that's absolutely, I think, the intent. I do think we can prevent that war in the Pacific through the right U.S. and allied military buildup. But you have to start doing a lot of things, which we're not yet executing on. But the bottom line is we have these two enemy states, and they are absolutely serious about their intent. And if we continue to show economic and military weakness, I think we're going to get the big problem. So there's still time to prevent that, but we have to be acting with extreme urgency at this point.
Jonathan, you've done such an incredible job on this from all of your books, certainly Vision of Victory, as well as your most recent decade. We so appreciate all of your knowledge on this subject, Jonathan. Thank you for all the work you've done.